Hello everybody, welcome on in. My name is Octavian and this is my Scion Rainbow Fire Trap build guide. This build was my planned league starter for 3.3, meant to carry me up into red maps cheaply and perhaps handle a shaper or two. It has since massively outperformed those expectations, bringing me to my first Uber Elder kill, insta-killing shaper phases in a matter of seconds, and murdering guardians. The core concept of the build is to take advantage of the frankly ridiculous 200% effectiveness of added damage that Fire Trap was blessed with in this league's patch notes, and some very powerful sources of flat added damage to get big ol' honkin' DPS numbers. This results in a Fire Trap that does far more than just fire damage, in fact doing hundreds of thousands of cold and lightning damage as well. This in turn makes penetration of all elemental types very important, which is the final crowning piece of the build, turning it into a massively effective bossing build. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of exactly how all this is achieved. Normally, I'd lead with an explanation of my class of choice for one of these guides, but I think I'll begin with Itemization this time, since the gearing of this build is far more core than the Ascendancy choice. That isn't really to say that picking Scion over Saboteur or Inquisitor doesn't have its pros or cons, but rather that the broken thing about this character has less to do with the Ascendancy than it does with Fire Trap's silly scaling with flat added damage. So that said, let's get into the first absolutely core piece of gear for this build, Malachi's Awakening. Malachi's Awakening is a helmet that was added in Bestiary League, which flew under many people's radars for pretty much the whole league, up until Incursion, and is the prophesied version of Malachi's Simula, which is garbage. However, when you upgrade this mask, it goes from garbage to godly, providing everything this build needs to oftentimes double your damage on the spot. This is due to how much flat damage of all different elemental types it offers to spells, which Fire Trap will gobble right up and spit back out twice as effectively. Malachi's Awakening adds a total of up to 250 average flat damage to spells, across cold, fire, and lightning. This is equivalent to about 4 or 5 very good Abyssal Jewels. The only restriction is that you are forced into being blood magic. However, this is actually a benefit for our purposes, since it means that due to the massive regen on offer from our Ascendancy, we effectively then have a license to print traps. This helmet is incredibly core, and the build is effectively built around it. Make obtaining one a priority. It is likely the single biggest upgrade you will see when building this character. Jumping off now from the single most important core item, we move to the next, Shroud of the Lightless. Shroud of the Lightless is the best option for the body armor slot that this build has, hands down. This is due to the necessity of obtaining penetration for the multiple elemental damage types that we end up dealing. This chest piece can be a bit pricey up front, as compared to something like a belly or a lore weave, but consider the invested cost of 6-linking an item as opposed to 5-linking. Because the all penetration is built in as a 6-link, you only ever need to 5-link a Shroud, which is remarkably inexpensive compared to 6-linking. This means that while you pay somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 2 exalts up front, you only end up spending perhaps a few hundred fusings linking it, rather than potentially 3, 5, or 10 times that. In addition to this, the Shroud provides another Abyssal Jewel socket, which is quite valuable for scaling Fire Trap. Moving on now to the boot slot, I've currently got equipped a pair of bubonic trails with 2 abyssal sockets. This should be the endgame goal, but is not necessary immediately out the gate. A pair with a single socket, which is far cheaper, or a pair of rare boots to help balance resistances can also be a fine option. Whatever boots you end up wearing, consider running Uber Labyrinth until you land on a good boot enchant. The best ones for this build are Crit if you haven't crit recently, which will always be active since trap crits are not counted as player crits, Damage penetrates resistances if you haven't killed recently, again, always active, and flat damage if you haven't killed recently. The crit enchant is best if your dagger is lacking in spell crit, pen best if your abyssal jewels are good enough to carry in terms of flat damage, and flat damage best if you're lacking good abyssal jewels. All of them, however, are good enough to keep. The issue of balancing res brings me to the next most important unique, a Wise Oak with triple balanced resistances. For those of you not familiar with how this flask works, it effectively is capable of granting you up to 15% penetration for every elemental damage type, as well as 10% reduced damage taken of each type. The caveat, however, is that your resistances need to be balanced exactly with each other in order for this to be active. That means that to get the penetration we need, each of your resistance total needs to be exactly the same. Exactly the same overcapped, that is, which can be a headache to set up. However, it is well worth it, both defensively and offensively. The incredible power of this flask being locked behind such a finicky requirement can make it difficult to upgrade gear without having to rebalance res across the board, which is why I suggest rings with resistance implicits to be able to use blesseds to make minor changes to resistance values, as well as crafted res rolls on gloves and rings and wherever else possible. Speaking of gloves, the best in slot pair of gloves for this build is going to be Shaper Touch gloves with the affix skills which throw traps, throw one additional trap. This improves your coverage for clear and your upfront burst for single target, and is all around one of the best effects for scaling trap damage you can possibly obtain. The Slave Driver's Hand, the unique trap-centric gloves which are added in Incursion League, are not an option, since they take up the glove slot, which is better occupied by these Shaper Touch gloves. Look to get as much life as you can here, as well as whatever resists you may need to balance your Wise Oak. The final unique I use in this build is in the shield slot. I make use of an On's Heritage, which has a sizable life total, and offers +3 max res so long as you never generate endurance charges. I do not use 2 fragilities, as some do, to activate the onslaught effect from the shield. I don't think this is worth giving up 2 jewel sockets, which have massive value for scaling fire traps. However, 3 max res is still more than worth it. And the decent life total, bit of armor, and bit of block is why a Saffles frame isn't in this slot instead. Saffles is certainly a decent option, offering 1% more max res. However, I found that I needed the life and physical damage reduction more often to survive physical damage, which was the culprit of my deaths far more than Elemental was. For your weapon, you're going to want to look for a dagger or scepter with as high attack speed as you can muster, so that your shield charge doesn't feel sluggish. Alongside this, you'll want spell damage, crit chance for spells, crit multi, and flat elemental damage added to spells. Any combination of these that you can afford is a good idea. This last roll, the flat damage, is less important here than in other places in the build, since we scale so much elsewhere that getting good multi and good crit out of the weapon slot is more important. On a Shaper Touch dagger, the mods Elemental gained as extra chaos and damage penetrates elemental resistances are both stellar mods, but such a dagger can get very pricey. I cannot really overstate how important it is, though, to get decent attack speed. Don't overlook this, or the build will feel slow and clunky. On to the jewelry. This is where you will be doing most of your res balancing. You'll probably also need a small strength roll somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 20 or 30, in order to equip On's Heritage. Diamond bases are great for rings, if you can fit them in, but they make balancing Wise Oak even more of a chore. The amulet slot can be Shaper Touched, with damage penetrates percent elemental resistances, if you can afford it. Other than that, high life rolls, good res, and you're golden. The belt slot should be a Stygian Vise, with life and what res you need for your Wise Oak. Try to find some chaos resistance here, or on your other jewelry. This league in particular, chaos res is highly valuable, and one of the easier places to find it is in the belt slot. An open prefix for crafted movement speed is also a plus. In this belt, as well as all the other abyssal sockets in the build, and regular sockets for that matter, we want to jam in as much flat elemental damage to spells as possible through abyssal jewels. These jewels should be hypnotics, with the total average flat damage being somewhere over 50 at least, with life rolls where possible. This is where the build's ability to scale upwards almost limitlessly comes into play, as the right abyssal jewels can be an incredibly long-term goal. However, the benefits of getting a perfect jewel over a jewel about 80% as good are not as significant as you might think, and that 80% strength one is going to be 1/5 the price. Set up a live search like this one, which I will have linked below the video as well, which simply has a sum total of 50 plus elemental damage to spells, and purchase 3 property ones with an open prefix and a good eye level to slam life, or 3 prop jewels with decent life and a good eye level to slam another flat roll. Before that, aim to get jewels with somewhere around 40 flat for a much lower price tag, as a stand-in until you can get your endgame jewels. Lastly, outside of the Wise Oak, my other flask slots are comprised of a Quicksilver Flask for mobility, buffing the shield charge, a Basalt Flask to deal with the build's weakness to physical damage, a Diamond Flask for reliable crits, and a Bubbling Life Flask for instant recovery in sticky situations. With itemization covered, let's move on to class choice and the passive tree. This build is done as an Ascendant, with Saboteur as a perfectly legitimate option as well. The reason, however, why I ended up going Ascendant was due to the significant quality of life benefits that Scion has over Shadow. First among these is positioning on the passive tree. This makes obtaining enough life nodes an easier task without having to give up as much power in other places. On top of this, Scion is granted additional passive points from the Ascendancy tree, which is also helpful in building a sturdy character. The second high-value quality of life benefit from Ascendant is the ability to pick up the Pathfinder sub-ascendancy, which gives exceptional mobility to shield charge through movement and attack speed, as well as ensuring that our Wise Oak and Basalt Flask are consistently up to deal with threats and garner some extra penetration. In a lot of cases, the Saboteur version will end up being higher consistent single-target DPS. But this is honestly simply irrelevant. Built properly, this build has enough damage with either version to kill Shaper phases in 2 to 3 seconds, at which point more damage is actually kind of useless. There is nothing in the game that has enough health to actually stand up to that much DPS output, so it is instead better to scale defensive stats or quality of life ones, getting the build to simply feel better to play through speed. The Ascendancy choices, then, are the Saboteur Sub-Ascendancy, which has all the best bits of Sab, that being Pen, Massive AoE, and Massive Recovery scaling, and Pathfinder, as mentioned earlier, which has the best mix of damage, defense, and quality of life out of all the options available. You can also go for Inquisitor, Elementalist, Chieftain. These are all somewhat decent options, but again, most of them scale damage in a build that does not need that. The passive tree does not take advantage of the ability to path out of other classes' starting nodes, so feel free to allocate your Uber points into whichever path of nodes suit you the best. Just get the 3 passive points from one of them. As far as the passive tree proper, it is mostly spent picking up crit, trap-focused nodes with throwing speed and/or trigger AoE, and life clusters. Notably important pickups include Acro and Phase Acro to help deal with Chaos Spitters and Incursions, Master Sapper and Blast Cascade for charge generation, and pretty much every trigger AoE node available, since that is the method by which the build ensures traps actually go off. The full passive tree is available in the description below. Lastly, let's go over the skill gems. We'll start with the main attraction, Fire Trap, and then move on to the supporting gems and such afterwards. First off, and very importantly, make sure your Fire Trap is socketed into your Shroud of the Lightless. This is very important, as otherwise it will not gain the benefit of the level 20 Elemental Pen support. The links in that 5 link will be, in order of importance, Fire Trap, Cluster Traps, Charge Traps, Trap and Mind Damage, and either Elemental Focus or Controlled Destruction. Cluster Traps is core to any trap build, multiplying the number of traps thrown to both increase upfront single target burst as well as magnify clear. Charge Traps is in the links in order to facilitate clear speed and quality of life, since this build would easily have enough damage to one-shot any mobs on a 4 or even a 3 link, so another damage gem is really not necessary. Trap and Mind Damage is one I'm still somewhat considering, due to the reduced throwing speed penalty. However, it is pretty massive damage for single target, and very easy to fit in or switch around. Lastly, LE Focus is the most upfront damage, ensuring bosses melt in seconds. If you want to be able to freeze trash, though, increased crits, control destruction, or even Immolate are options. However, Immolate is not really very good if you have quite good other gear, as you begin to reach the point where further flat damage scaling is less effective than another multiplier. As well as that, Immolate will only ever proc on the second trap throw, which for most enemies never needs to happen. The next most important link setup is going to be your mobility. This will consist of Shield Charge, Faster Attacks, Fortify, and Culling Strike. Ensure that your Culling Strike is 20% quality, in order to get the 10% attack speed that's provided by this quality benefit. This is important, as you want to be able to reliably dodge boss one-shots and get through maps that much faster. Moving on now to auras, there aren't any. This build is blood magic, and Malachi's means we don't want to reserve any life. It is, however, possible to use an Essence Worm and fit it in Anger, but this is difficult to do while maintaining Wise Oak balance, and not really worth attempting unless you are quite wealthy and patient. The supporting cast of traps consists of Bear Trap linked to increased duration, in order to shred through bosses even more effectively, as well as Flamethrower Trap linked to Trap and Mind Damage, Controlled Destruction, and Concentrated Effect. You can drop the bear trap to hinder particularly nasty melee bosses, or to leave enemies vulnerable to your fire traps. The flamethrower trap excels at controlling areas of the map, and are quite useful during breaches in which you can leave them at one side to take care of any latent mob spawns while you clear out the rest of it. As well as this, they offer very significant supplementary single target, particularly on less mobile or larger bosses. My cast when damage taken setup has an Immortal Call and an Enfeeble link to it, both of which are quite helpful for surviving incoming physical attack damage. The damage source this build is most vulnerable to. A Chaos Golem is also an option here, but I find golems quite frustrating to keep up. Lastly, use a Vol Righteous Fire, linked to increased duration as a temporary massive buff to your trap damage, as the 40% more multiplier to spell damage it provides is essentially a 7th link on a button. That's really about it, though. Thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed. The build guide on the forums will likely answer any lingering questions you have, but if it doesn't, then feel free to ask them in the comments below. One last note, you should pick up Alira as your bandit, and Brine King and Shikari as your pantheons, though you can of course play around with pantheon powers as you see fit. There's not much opportunity cost to switching them. If this video wasn't enough content for you by itself, please join me at my live stream on Twitch. I'm there every day from 1 PM until 9 PM Eastern Standard Time, except Sundays when I end 3 hours early. You can also, of course, browse through the rest of my videos here on YouTube. I hope to see you all in the next one. Have a good one.